If there is an opposite approach to constraint-induced aphasia therapy, then that approach is something that's called PACE, or Promoting Aphasics Communicative Effectiveness. Promoting aphasics communicative effectiveness, well, continue to call PACE, is written originally by two authors by the name of Gene Wilcox and Albin Davis. And it's based on the aspect of language that we call pragmatics. Okay. Pragmatics has to do with the usefulness and utility of language. Do we actually get to communicate? So it's totally the opposite of constraint-induced, which says no, only that modality is going to be acceptable. PACE says anything that the person does that communicates is acceptable. In fact, the goal of PACE is to encourage the patient to use all of his available modalities in order to communicate, and any successful communication is reinforced and rewarded. Okay. It's based on four very important principles that I think bear elaboration, and again, it's in your textbook, and you should be reading this. In a PACE therapy session, and again, when you go back into Blackboard, you'll see that there are two different PACE sessions that are there. Again, they're mock sessions done by graduate students, one of them with fluent aphasic patient, one with a non-fluent aphasic patient. It's not all that different, really, but for whatever, they're both available, so I share them with you. So the first principle of PACE therapy is that the clinician and the client participate equally as a sender and receiver of a message. So let's think about that. Let's think about, and we'll use this as a model as we go through this, that you are sitting in a coffee shop with a friend of yours. And you haven't seen them in a while, and you just say, listen, why don't we go out for a cup of coffee? We're going to go across the street to Junior's. We're going to have a cup of coffee. And we're going to catch up and we're going to talk. All right. And that's communication, isn't it? That is communication. That's how people communicate. I don't mean the coffee, but it's not like there is a person who directs communication and a person who receives the communication and a person who has to communicate and a person who just has to evaluate it. We don't have any of that kind of stuff, right? When we have normal communication, the two communicators in therapy, we call them a clinician and a client, but they participate equally. Okay, it's not like one of them is always sending and the other one's always receiving. But that's what happens in therapy, isn't it? Right? Someone's always directing and the other person has to respond. So you're providing a stimulus, the patient has to provide a response, you get to evaluate the response, and then you modify and blah, blah, blah. Everybody has a role. That's not true in normal communication. It's equal. And that has to be done in true PACE therapy. All right. Number two, when you sit and talk to your friend at Junior's, you don't review stuff that you both know or that one of you know. I mean, you're going to tell your friend something that you know, but they probably don't. And that's reason, hey, did you hear that so-and-so got engaged? Did you hear so-and-so graduated from school? They got this great job. Did you hear this? And the other person will say, wow, I didn't know that, but did you know that? Okay. What you're doing is you're exchanging new information. Isn't that what communication is all about? Isn't that what normally happens? Okay. We don't review old stuff. That's boring and that's known. But in therapy, that's all we do. Okay. We don't do new stuff. We just kind of, what's the name of this? Well, everybody knows that. So yeah, maybe now that patient's having a little bit of trouble with that. But there's certainly no exchange. Does the patient tell you anything? Do we have a format that allows the patient to tell you anything? And we don't. We only have them respond. That's all they do, is they respond. And so that's a violation of pragmatics, and it's a violation of PACE. Okay? In PACE therapy, the client is allowed free choice with respect to selection of communicative channels. Okay? Totally the opposite of constraint-induced therapy, where they're given no choice. They're told this is the way you will communicate. Here, the patient is never constrained if anything. If anything, we'll encourage them to use multimodalities as long as it's effective. But if they're effective with one, we're not going to say, well, no, I want to hear it another way. we won't do that. It's just when they're not effective, we'll say, well, let's try it a different way, or let's try it this way or that way. But we're encouraging multiple modalities. If you were sitting with your friend at juniors again, and you wanted them to pass the salt shaker, but your mouth is kind of full and you kind of like just pick up your hand and kind of gesture shaking, that you want them to pass the salt. Do you think your friend would say, I'm sorry, that's not acceptable? Say, what is it that you want? We don't do that, right? We would never do that. It's fine. He communicated, so I'm going to pass the salt. All right. When, again, you're sitting at juniors with your buddy, okay, and the buddy says, hey, did you hear so-and-so got engaged? They got engaged to, they got engaged to so-and-so. And you say, wow, you said that so well. You would never do that either, okay? We don't give feedback. We don't reinforce in that way. How do you give reinforcement? Natural, just by indicating and making it clear that you understood it and you got it, and therefore it's fine. So if I say, can you pass the ketchup? You don't say, wow, you asked for that so clearly. Sure, here, I'll pass the ketchup. What do? You pass the ketchup. And that's the reinforcement. Okay? If there was any doubt, and it probably was none, but if there was any doubt in the speaker's mind that they didn't communicate effectively, well, by passing the ketchup, then they know they did. On the other hand, if they say pass the ketchup, they thought, and you pass the sugar, then that's also feedback and saying, ooh, there's a breakdown here someplace. And so PACE is based on normal communicative functioning. It insists on these 4 rules. And again, read about it, look at the videos, and you'll get a good idea of how it happens. Okay. The question is when to use PACE. There are some people who will use PACE only when they have finished with what might be referred to as traditional therapy. I've worked on all the strategies I can come up with for retrieval of words and improving auditory comprehension and improving reading and writing and everything else. But, none of it is really great. But you know what I think? That if I now use PACE and I encourage all of those things together, then the sum total of the 4 modalities in PACE is going to be greater than any one modality all by itself. And so I'm going to have a better communicator. There are others who might include parts of PACE really from the beginning. I'm not going to venture an opinion on this. I think you have to work with what works for you. And then you may not, and I would encourage you, by the way, to not adopt a posture and say, I will never do it then, I will always do it this way. I would think you should be doing it based on what the patient will benefit from the most. I think there are some patients who will benefit from having principles of PACE imposed from the beginning, and others perhaps really will do better if you wait till later. And then kind of put it all together and see what we come up with. Okay. Okay, and again, there are 2. One is for non-fluent aphasia and one is for fluent aphasia. Okay, we have 2 topics left. That is it. Okay. This really could be a very lengthy discussion. It's obviously not going to be a very lengthy discussion. You should be reading about this. You should be thinking about this. There is a whole lot of literature on it. And the question that we're going to try to answer now is, who's likely to get better? Who's likely going to get better spontaneously, even, and certainly who's going to benefit from therapy? We owe that because one of the first questions that the patient, or certainly the family, or maybe the physician, and certainly the third-party payer is going to ask, is this patient going to get better? Meaning, am I wasting my money? Am I wasting my hopes? Should I be just thinking about, nursing home placement already because nothing's going to get better here? Not that those are mutually exclusive, by the way. I mean, a person can get much more improved than aphasia and still wind up in a nursing home for social and physical reasons. But in other words, should I be wasting my time and emotions on thinking that the patient's going to get better when in fact there's very little chance that's going to happen. Or is this a patient that has really an excellent prognosis, an excellent predictive factor for improvement, and we should really be investing time and money and effort and hope in that happening? Okay, well, what's that based on? What are you going to be thinking about? What are the factors that will be going? And so I'm going to review a number of them as they're outlined here and talk about them and see which ones have validity, real validity, in other words, demonstrable validity, and which ones are just kind of emotional. And again, there's in no particular order. The first is age. And I think subjectively, we very often will just think that in general, there's a bias that older people are probably not as likely to change. Younger people are more likely to change. And so older people are perhaps, again, all other things being equal. Now, that's something I'm going to keep on saying when we have this discussion. What that would mean operationally is that if age is, let's say, younger or older, but gender, handedness, educational literacy level, time post onset, etiology, blah, 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 are all exactly the same, but age was different, would it make a difference? Okay. The reality is you'll never find that in real life, where you have two patients who are identical except for one variable. But that's the only valid way to think about it and to assess it. So we'll try to keep our discussion that way, but it may not ever happen. And again, when we talk about age, we're not talking about the difference between someone who's 60 and 62. We're talking about someone who is perhaps 40 and 70, some significant age difference, decades of age difference at least one, 60 and 70 or something like that. Does that make a difference? What we find is we really have no data that indicate that age makes all that much of a difference, except that age tends to come along with a bunch of other things. Because when I said all of the things being equal, they're never really equal. The person who's 80 is much more likely to have had other health issues, much more likely to have had a previous vascular incident. Maybe they had a heart attack. Maybe they had a previous stroke. Maybe they also have heart disease. They have high cholesterol. They have high blood pressure. They've had maybe mild head traumas. All kinds of other things may have happened. As one gets older, you don't know this yet, but I'm attesting to it. As one gets older, things happen. And so it's very unlikely that a person who's older has exactly the same profile as someone who's younger, except that they're older. The person who's 40 or 50 probably doesn't yet have a significant health history. And so age may come along with lots of other things, but age per se probably doesn't matter all that much. We're probably all familiar with somebody who is quote unquote older and they're just doing great, and they're still playing golf and they're still playing tennis and they're doing everything that they were supposed to, maybe going to work. They're totally oriented. They don't forget anything. And we know younger people where that's not true. And so age all by itself probably doesn't mean all that much, but again, age probably comes along with other things. Okay, does gender, should we be betting more on a woman than a man on a woman? We talked about this a long time ago. We had a little bit of data about women having stronger language skills inherently, but the fact of the matter is we know nothing about women who are aphasic as opposed to men who are aphasic. All of our data about aphasia is all lumped together. We have no reason to think, frankly, that it makes any difference, and we have no data to say that it is different. And so, no, it's really not an issue. Handedness, maybe. If a person is aphasic and they have a left CVA, but they're left-handed, as opposed to the more typical right-handed person, okay? Then the left-handed person is more likely to either have, and their left CVA and they're aphasic, the odds are their aphasia is not as severe, because they probably have some language in the right hemisphere as well. And even if it is equal, that's reasonably severe right now, the odds are they may have a better chance of recovery because, again, the intactness of the right hemisphere, and the right hemisphere probably has some at least latent language abilities. So, again, all other things being equal, I would bet on the left-handed person more than the right-handed person, but that won't overcome other issues. Like if the left-handed person is just much more severe, I think that will offset the handedness issue. So it might be an issue. It's not an overwhelmingly important one. What about education or literacy level? And they tend to work together. I mean, people who tend to be very literate tend to have had a higher educational level. Does it make a difference? Well, it doesn't seem to make a difference to things like being able to talk and understand. Point to the cup. You don't need to have that much of an education or reading levels to be able to do that kind of a task. You might argue that they're inherently perhaps more linguistically sophisticated and they have a better kind of a brain network for language, and you could make a decent argument about things like that. But does that mean that they recover better? And I'm not sure about that. Sometimes it works against you. I've had patients who clearly, before their stroke, before their aphasia, were highly literate. They may have been judges or community leaders or professors or something like that. And now they're aphasic. And so I have two aphasic patients whose PICA scores are identical. One of them was a judge and the other one was a truck driver with an 8th grade education. You could argue that the judge has much better skills, better learning skills, better inherent language skills, and may be able to do a better job of recovering and working with therapy, and that may be true. And that may not be true for the other person who's on the other end of the continuum. On the other hand, who's going to get closer to premorbid levels if they're both at the same level of aphasia right now? Well, my guess is the truck driver is going to get better. He's going to get closer to normal levels than the judge, who has so far to go to get back to normal levels that his therapy just may be deemed much less effective, more of a failure. Whereas the truck driver gets, he may get a lot of his stuff back. He never really read a lot. He read the headlines of the Daily News, and that he could still do that. Where the judge is used to reading, the Times every day and legal opinions and following arguments in court, then wow, he's never going to get to that. And so he may wind up, just by virtue of his education, becoming more of a failure. It can work both ways. And again, I don't think it sways me either way to make a prediction based on that. But it's something I need to know about as the therapist. Time post onset. At what point in time am I making this decision? When am I thinking about, is this person going to get better or not? Well, the earlier that I'm thinking about this, the more likely that I'm going to see change. So if I'm looking at a person who's a month after stroke, he's got a very good chance of changing dramatically over the next 6 months, maybe even for the year. But if you're asking me that question only after the year, or maybe after the 6 months, well, there isn't that much more change that I'm planning to see. The brain isn't as plastic anymore. I'm not going to be seeing all that much change. Okay, we're going to stop because we've exceeded time, and we're going to come back.